As I mentioned earlier today, I found out that Matt Walsh was in theaters for whatever reason, um, for a documentary film called Am I Racist? And I decided to see that movie so you don't have to. My name is Joe. I practice talking on the internet, and we're gonna maybe it'll be brief. I don't know. Just do my sort of preliminary thoughts on this film. Like I said, I was streaming. I saw it was out, and I went and saw it. It's kind of a risk for Daily Wire. This is their first sort of jump into movies that are like in theaters, which is quite bizarre. Basically what the film does, it's in the format of a mockumentary where basically Matt Walsh goes undercover as a DEI, as like the title says here in the Wikipedia thing, a DEI trainee, attending anti-racism workshops and then interviewing experts and stuff. Now, the synopsis is, this is pretty straightforward, so I'll read through this briefly. Matt Walsh finds himself in a coffee shop reminiscing about the prevalence of racism in society. He decides to embark on a journey to find out whether or not he is racist. After being ousted from a support group because of white guilt, Walsh decides to take on a persona similar to that of the gender studies professor he interviewed in What is a Woman? He goes on to receive a DEI certification and assumes the identity of a DEI expert. Sequentially, he begins his quest to, quote, do the work and started off his journey. Among things, Matt convinces passersby to sign a petition to rename the Washington Monument the George Floyd Monument, raise the structure by 30%, and repaint it black. Matt also goes to a biker bar hoping to expose the racism of white hillbillies and interviews Black Americans who tell him that the solution to racism is to love one another. The film culminates in Walsh, now an experienced anti-racism activist, hosting an anti-racist workshop called Do the Work Workshop, where he tells white people they are inherently racist, demonstrates speaking out against racism by viciously condemning his Uncle Frank for a racist joke he made 20 years ago, and encourages in self-flagellation as a solution to white guilt. The show, or this movie, ends with Walsh having a change of heart and ending the workshop, stating publicly the whole thing is a scam. In the final scene, Walsh imagines himself sharing his findings with the world before sitting down for coffee with his Uncle Frank. That's pretty much exactly to the T what happened. It's kind of in the format, as it mentions in the Wikipedia article, as a mockumentary. I guess we'll start with the good. There's not much good about this, if I'm being very honest. I think if I'm really trying to find things that are good about it, I appreciate that when he did sit with experts and interview them, there wasn't that many interruptions to a fault. Certain parts of the film were very long because of that, like the very beginning when he's talking to this one expert he finds. They do like this circle support group, and it's kind of like, I always find that kind of stuff interesting, of like seeing how different people do these different jobs and these different tasks. So that part always interests me. The interviews by and large were okay. Like, I understand that Matt has an axe to grind, so it's always going to be painted in this naivete that allows him to move and navigate in certain spaces. So I think he uses that to his advantage, that not every single person is deeply tuned in to the world and the happenings of the world. So he's very much like using, you could say, just like ordinary people just going about their everyday life, and then using that to paint a more broader picture. By and large, people in the film that I like, in the theater that I saw it in, laughed at certain points where laughter was, I don't want to say warranted, but laughter was attempted. So I guess for that portion of the audience, it worked. So it worked for that group of people, which I guess is what you're trying to do here. Like I did also appreciate that there were very few instances of him going after black people. And so I don't know if that was a conscious decision or just what came out to be. Because if I were to make an argument for him, it seems like what he's directly critiquing are white Americans and white scholars going into this work and doing this kind of whiteness studies. I think that's really like, that was the target's, what's the word, institution that he was going after. So that was fine. It wasn't executed well, but I understand, like, I understood his criticism, like, I guess, which is a plus. With that being said, in understanding his criticism, I don't know if what it was trying to land worked. Because if you're approaching this in a way that this is all a farce, then everybody is going to interpret it as such. And there's a bunch of like examples of that. I was done for the good, by the way, run to the bad stuff. There's a scene where he's interviewing, I don't want to say what he's interviewing, like in this like community circle. Not the community circle. There's like this white guilt circle. I forget what it's called exactly. A support group or something. There's a black woman leading it, and he leads with introducing himself as Steve instead of Matt. And then and then in the session itself, he's very, very obtuse. He's very interrupty, but he does this interruption in this guise of being like questionable and asking questions and trying to be receptive, but it just doesn't work because he's not good at that. He doesn't do a good job at parody, masking reality. Like, what makes something like Borat so effective is Sacha Baron Cohen does a very good job at the presentation portion of the falseness, if that makes sense. So, and then he also has the advantage of people not knowing him, at least not well. So he's able to move and act and navigate in ways that are funny and spontaneous. And basically every single time he goes into each of these settings, these like I don't say study, but these different DEI white, I'm not sure, I can't even call it DEI, but like whiteness studies adjacent circles, like the support group. There's a later portion where he's teaching a class himself. He co-ops this thing, Race to Dinner. I didn't even know this existed, but basically we're a bunch of what appears to be just like white women talking to, like, having a conversation led by a black woman and a person of color. I don't know what their racial identity is. And it doesn't work very well because he doesn't do a good job at infiltrating. So it always comes off more ridiculous because he's being overtly ridiculous as he's doing it. And it's very Eric Andre-esque, but again, like, if you know, like, hey, this is the Daily Wire, this is Matt Walsh, is trying to send some type of political or social stance, but it just doesn't do it effectively at all. Because it's trying to be a mockumentary and a documentary at the same time, but the documentary portion and the mockumentary portion don't work in cohesion with each other. Like there's a huge bit about the parody of Jesse Smollett, and basically alluding to like how ridiculous that situation was. But the problem is that everybody knew that situation was ridiculous, and there are like a bunch of poorly aged clips, which are whatever, but it uses that to paint the idea that like the increase in prevalence of hate crimes is conflated, because he brings on that dude that wrote that book. I think it's like what, Hate Crime Hoax, I think it's the book. But then even then in the interview setting, he's basically trying to like present himself as somebody who is skeptical of the idea that like hate crimes are a hoax. Like it's really weird. And it doesn't really do a good job at trying to set up what it's trying to say. And then the final landing is basically to say that, hey, you know, these programs are stupid. These like the very ideas that are presented around race relations are silly. Let's just like all kind of just treat each other like, basically the whole like content of character narrative stuff. But then in the film itself, it, as the synopsis like tries to explain, is that he imagines himself sharing his findings in this coffee shop setting that he tries to build, but in the film it's him talking to himself. Like he imagines himself saying these things, because like the idea is that he goes to this coffee shop, he's at this coffee shop, and he's thinking about like, oh, I'm coming to terms with these things, I don't know what's going on, let me go on this journey, and then after this journey all this happened, and now I think this is all stupid, and the DEI and anti-racism is a hoax. But it doesn't do a good job at purveying the ridiculousness that he's trying to present. Like, so it's just speaking to a portion of the audience very overtly that was already in agreement that they think it's silly. So it's basically some, what's the word? Self-indulging. But again, like he's more than welcome to do that, but I just don't think it's done effectively. He's appealing to a particular part of the audience, but just doesn't do it in an effective manner. He alludes to this idea often that he's going to either do something in blackface and do something in drag, or some way to present as a woman. Like that's alluded into certain parts of this, but he doesn't go there. But the problem is like the way that he sets it up isn't effective. When I say the way he sets it up is like, okay, so like there's a portion where he talks about the idea of like race to dinner, which is that round table of just predominantly white women led in a conversation of a black woman and another woman of color. And then he paints of like, well, how can I get into like listening to these conversations? And then the bit builds to just him being a waiter. And then not only is he a waiter in this, he's incredibly inefficient at being a waiter. So like he's stumbling around, he's being overly persistent about giving certain like pieces of food to the guest of this. It's just really sloppy. And then he co-ops it in such a way where he's like, yeah, like a waiter listening into the conversations, like, yeah, I agree. But the problem with that is it's all filmed. Every portion of these scenes that they're trying to convey, they all are presupposed that they paid for these things to happen. Like the guilt support group in the beginning is filmed, and they show the cost of how much it was to make that work. They then show the race to dinner. That's also paid for. All the interviews were paid a certain amount. He paid, apparently, if we want to believe that what he said in the video was, the video is basically a YouTube video. In the if I believe that the costs that he conveyed for people to speak in his movie were true, he paid the lady from that Sesame Street incident $50,000 to talk, and she had maybe 4 minutes of speaking time in the film. It was really bizarre. And then like he basically said like, well, she didn't want to speak at first, but then we paid her money, so now she's talking. And it's like, oh, okay. Yeah, like if somebody, like, people aren't just going to sit down for random interviews. Like, yeah, like this was if you're going to monetize essentially what this woman was describing at the time as traumatic experience, yeah, she's going to ask you to pony up. The bit that's probably going to get the most attention is a really bizarre chain of events where he's interviewing Robin DiAngelo, and then he paints this idea or presents this premise where he brings on one of the producers of the thing who happens to be black, and then with that he pays his black producer reparations, but it's just basically essentially goes into his wallet and gives him money, and then gently convinces Robin DiAngelo to give him money as well. But the problem is that she conveys the entire time that like this doesn't make sense. So the bit's trying to convey that like even like the extension of this racial reimagining or awakening is that if a black person asks for money and goes to call reparations, then you accept it. Or an alternative way of looking at it is like, oh, like if you want to give black people money as reparation, that's an acceptable thing that we ought to do. And then like she uncomfortably gives the guy $30. It does not work. It does not land in a way that's not even rhetorically effective, but in terms of the scene, effective at all. Because basically he's pushing Dr. DiAngelo to give the money. It's really weird scene. And then she even explains that, like, yeah, this is not some like individualistic thing. It's just all bad. And the biggest, probably the most egregious thing for me is that it's just boring. There's nothing. If you are a conservative who's already skeptical of race things, and you already think all these people are race hustlers and they're all profiting off of minorities and profiting off of making fun of white people, then you were already sold prior to that. Like, you're already sold on this idea that this was all stupid. So it's just, yeah, it doesn't necessarily work. It doesn't work as a documentary. It moves as a mockumentary, but it's not necessarily saying anything. And again, there's like this whole step thing, and it mentions this in here where like he eventually has this thing that's called Do the Work Workshop, but he goes to local news syndicates and advertises it. But the problem with that is because news has to disclose things, like it was a sponsored sequence of the Daily News. So he gave them money to present himself as a DEI expert for people to come to these workshops. But the problem is like, that's not DEI. And again, like there's a point in the thing where he takes what he believes to be a DEI course and gets a DEI certification, but anybody that knows like this work, that's not how that works at all. So it's like it's not, he conflates he conflates people's different areas of expertise into this umbrella of DEI, but then he presumes that the audience also knows what this is. It's just not great. Now, what are the consequences of this? Like, the film already made its money back, so I guess it's like a low risk, low reward. As it mentions here in the wiki, I Am Racist opened at 1.96 million on its opening day, including Thursday previews, and 4.7 for its opening weekend. It was the fourth grossing of all films that weekend. Just for reference, like, is competing with Usher's thing, and just in case you want to see that, by the way, that's also being well received. I don't even think it's interesting. Is not showing its box office performance, so we'll probably see a bit more of that tomorrow, or even later today. But interesting, yeah, it doesn't show up in the first wiki thing, not just the first wiki, the first internet search. So if anybody has that while I'm still doing this recording thing, you can feel free to send it over my way. But anyway, yeah, I mean, if you don't want to see the film, but you kind of want to be caught up, the wiki article does a decent job at everything that you'll see in it. It actually covers exactly beat for beat. And yeah, that's it. I would not recommend going to see this in theaters. I wouldn't even recommend getting a Daily Wire subscription to go see it. I don't think it's really worth actual physical money to see it. I don't think you're missing much. It's not really contributing to any part of any conversation. And I don't know, like, I don't know what Matt Walsh's future is outside of a Democratic presidency. Like, I think a lot of these like culture war things are just slowly subsiding. And I think in general, they lost. I think people like Matt Walsh and others have kind of lost this part of their argumentation and what they're trying to do. So there isn't much left. There's just not much left. So, but anyway, yeah, so I don't know what Matt Walsh's political future entails. It's not this. I think if you're Daily Wire, you're probably thinking that this is a net positive, especially considering that their like filmography of Daily Wire Studios is pretty limited, right? They had that one what's the word I'm thinking of? They have like a few things within entertainment. Yeah, this Terror on the Prairie. But this didn't release, I think, in theaters. So there wasn't a lot of like risk in doing that. It was just a reason to give I had a limited release of $13,115. That's bad. Yeah, I think I don't know. I don't know what this is trying to do, but it's just kind of fine. It's not saying anything profound that's new. It doesn't really do anything in its satirical elements that's actually funny or interesting. So it just kind of meanders a bit. It's just not good. Not good. Not good. Not good. So yeah, hopefully that was enough information that I could portray about this, and I'm gonna go argue with my chat again.